In the 1930s, as tensions simmered across the Pacific, one man in Japan saw the future with haunting clarity. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, and his story is a chilling lesson in what happens when truth is silenced by pride. Yamamoto wasn't just another admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was a man who knew his enemy, perhaps better than they knew themselves. He had walked the halls of Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., and marveled at the industrial heartland of America. He had seen the assembly lines of Detroit, where cars rolled out with a speed and efficiency that was simply unimaginable back in Japan. He understood that America's power wasn't just in its battleships, but in its factories, its oil fields, and its sheer, overwhelming scale. While his superiors in Tokyo were blinded by dreams of imperial glory, Yamamoto was doing the cold, hard math. He saw a nation with a population twice the size of Japan's, and an industrial output that dwarfed it by a factor of nearly 10. This wasn't a country you could simply defeat with a surprise attack. This was a titan, a sleeping giant. And so, he warned them. In meeting after meeting, he argued passionately against a war with the United States. He sent letters and cables, pleading with the high command to see reason. His words were prophetic. "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences," he famously stated, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." He knew Japan could win battles, but America could win the war. But in the corridors of power, his warnings fell on deaf ears. The Japanese army and a powerful faction within the Navy were gripped by a dangerous ideology. They believed in something called Yamato Damashi, the unique, unconquerable Japanese spirit. To them, war wasn't about numbers or resources. It was a contest of willpower. They looked at America's industrial might and saw material without spirit. They saw a nation softened by luxury, a population of individualists who lacked the collective will for a prolonged, bloody conflict. They were convinced that a swift, decisive blow would shatter American morale, forcing them to the negotiating table and leaving Japan to dominate the Pacific. This cultural arrogance was a fatal flaw. They fundamentally misunderstood the American character. They saw consumerism and mistook it for weakness, not realizing it was the byproduct of a massive, resilient economy that could be retooled for war at a moment's notice. They dismissed the warnings from their own expert, a man who had looked into the eyes of the giant and measured its strength. The militarists believed that their fighting spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. They were certain that one Japanese soldier, imbued with the spirit of the samurai, was worth 10 Americans. It was a romantic, intoxicating idea, and it led them down a path to ruin. The internal struggle was fierce. Yamamoto, despite his grave reservations, was a patriot. Bound by duty, he was tasked with planning the very attack he had advised against. If war was inevitable, he reasoned, the only chance is slim, desperate chances to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the outset. This would buy Japan the 6 months to a year he had talked about. Time to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and fortify a defensive perimeter. His plan was brilliant in its audacity, a masterstroke of naval aviation strategy. The target was Pearl Harbor. He meticulously planned the operation, leveraging Japan's superior carrier doctrine and the element of complete surprise. He knew the risks were immense. If the American aircraft carriers, which were his primary targets, were not in port, the attack would be a strategic failure. As the task force sailed in absolute radio silence across the vast Pacific, the fate of the empire hung in the balance. Yamamoto's mood was somber. He was a gambler, as he once described himself. And this was the biggest gamble of his life, a bet made against his own better judgment. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the gamble seemed to pay off. The attack was a stunning tactical success. Japanese pilots, executing the plan with lethal precision, caught the American base completely off guard. Battleships were sunk or crippled, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was left a smoldering ruin. Across Japan, news of the victory was met with wild celebrations. The streets of Tokyo filled with jubilant crowds. The government declared a great triumph, proof of Japan's divine destiny and the superiority of its warrior spirit. The militarists who had dismissed Yamamoto's concerns felt utterly vindicated, but aboard his flagship, the Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, there was no celebration. As the reports of the successful attack flooded in, Yamamoto's staff saw not a man overjoyed with victory, but one burdened by a terrible premonition. He was told of the public euphoria, the parades, the triumphant headlines. His response was quiet and chilling. He confided in his diary, and to those closest to him, "I fear all we have done," he wrote, "is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He knew the truth, but the cheering crowds did not. The American carriers had been at sea and escaped unscathed. The base's vital fuel depots and repair facilities remained intact, and most importantly, the attack had not broken the American will. It had forged it into steel. The material without spirit that the army scoffed at was about to be animated by a fury the likes of which the world had never seen. In Tokyo, they celebrated about a won. Yamamoto, however, mourned a war lost. The first 6 months of running wild had just begun, but the clock was now ticking. The giant was awake, and its shadow was already falling across the Pacific. The path from Pearl Harbor would not lead to the swift victory Japan's leaders had promised, but to a long grinding war of production and attricienta. Very War Yamamoto knew his country could never win. His warnings had become a prophecy, and the tragic consequences were about to unfold. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a stunning success, but it awakened a sleeping giant. 6 months later, in the vast expanse of the Pacific, the tide of war would turn in a single, catastrophic day. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, the moment Japan's dream of empire began to unravel. In early June 1942, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, sought a decisive battle to eliminate the remaining American carriers. His plan was complex, a multi-pronged operation involving nearly the entire combined fleet. The target was Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategic stepping stone to Hawaii. Yamamoto believed that by threatening Midway, he could lure the American fleet into a trap and annihilate it once and for all. He was confident. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not lost a major sea battle in centuries. Their carrier pilots, the veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean, were the best in the world. Their ships, particularly the formidable aircraft carriers, Kagasoryu and Hiryu, formed the most powerful naval strike force on the planet. On paper, the odds were overwhelmingly in Japan's favor. But the Americans had a secret weapon. Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by the brilliant Joseph Rochefort, had cracked Japan's naval code. JN-25. They knew Yamamoto's plante. Target, the timing, the forces involved. While the Japanese believed the American carriers were licking their wounds far away, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was setting his own trap. He positioned his 3 available carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired York II northeast of Midway, lying in wait. The Hunter was about to become the... On the morning of June 4th, the Japanese attack on Midway Atoll began as planned, but the American carriers were nowhere to be seen. Vice Admiral Chuti Nagumo, commander of the Japanese carrier strike force, grew uneasy. His reconnaissance was poor, and he was flying blind. His planes were returning from the Midway strike, needing to rearm. It was at this critical moment that a Japanese scout plane finally spotted American ships. The report was delayed and vague, but it confirmed Nagumo's worst fear. An American carrier was nearby. Now, Nagumo faced a terrible dilemma. His attack planes were armed with bombs for a second strike on Midway's land-based installations. To attack the American carrier, they needed to be rearmed with torpedoes, a process that took time and left his hangar decks cluttered with explosive ordnance. As his crews frantically worked, American torpedo bombers, flying low and slow from the U.S. carriers, began their attacks. They were brave, almost suicidal, pressing their assaults without fighter cover. One by one, they were shot out of the sky by Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. It was a massacre. Not a single torpedo found its mark. For a moment, It seemed the Japanese had weathered the storm. Their defenses had held, but the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. They had pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the skies above the Japanese fleet wide open, and that's when the American dive bombers arrived. Plummeting out of the sun, unseen and unopposed, squadrons from the Enterprise in Yorktown descended upon the Japanese carriers. In a span of just 5 minutes, the fate of the battle was sealed. Bombs slammed into the decks of Akagi Kaga and Soryu, igniting the fuel and ordnance packed in their hangars. The explosions were catastrophic. 3 of Japan's finest carriers were transformed into raging inferno. A veteran Japanese pilot, looking back at his ship, described it as looking like a hell on earth. The pride of the WWII was gone in the blink of an eye. Only one Japanese carrier, the Heru, escaped the initial onslaught. She quickly launched a counterstrike, managing to find and cripple the American carrier Yorktown, but her survival was short-lived. Later that afternoon, American planes found Hiryu and sent her to the bottom, joining her sister ships in a watery grave. The Yorktown, despite valiant efforts to save her, would also sink a few days later after being hit by a Japanese submarine. But the exchange was devastatingly one-sided. For the loss of one American carrier, Japan had lost all 4 of its frontline fleet carriers, the very heart of its naval power. By King Tokyo, the news was met with stunned silence and utter disbelief. The High Command couldn't comprehend it. How could their invincible navy, their elite pilots, be defeated so utterly? The loss of 4 carriers in a single day was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological cataclysm. Initial reports were suppressed, censored, and distorted. The public was told of a great victory at Midway. Even many senior officers were kept in the dark. The survivors of the battle were quarantined and sworn to secrecy, their eyewitness accounts buried to preserve the myth of Japan's invincibility. But the truth could not be contained forever. Within the highest echelons of the military bureaucracy, a terrifying realization began to dawn. Yamamoto's pre-war warning echoed in their minds. He could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he had no confidence. 6 months had passed almost to the day. The industrial might of the United States, which they had so underestimated, was now a terrifying reality. While Japan struggled to replace its losses, American shipyards were already building a new generation of Essex-class carriers at a staggering rate. Aircraft factories were churning out planes that would soon surpass the legendary Zero. Midway was the turning point. It wasn't just about the ships and planes lost. It was about the loss of something far more critical: experienced pilots. Japan's pilot training program was slow and rigid. It could never replace the hundreds of skilled veterans who perished in the flames of their carriers. The Americans, in contrast, had a vast and flexible training pipeline, capable of producing thousands of new pilots. The qualitative edge Japan had enjoyed was gone, and it would never be regained. The defeat forced a painful reckoning. Pride and a refusal to admit failure prevented the leadership from changing course or informing the public. They doubled down, committing the nation to a war they now secretly knew they probably couldn't win. The illusion of a swift, glorious victory was shattered. The first cracks had appeared in the foundation of their war effort. Doubt, once unthinkable, now crept into the minds of Japan's strategists. The path forward was no longer a triumphant march, but a desperate, grinding struggle for survival. The war was far from over, but after Midway, the end was already in sight. In August 1942, the first American boots hit the beaches of a remote, jungle-choked island in the Solomons called Guadalcanal. This single campaign would become the turning point in the Pacific War, not just because of the fighting, but because of what happened behind the front lines. It was here, in the mud and the malaria, that Japan's war machine slammed headfirst into the crushing reality of American industrial power. This is the story of how Guadalcanal became a grinding machine, revealing a terrifying truth to the Japanese High Command. They were fighting an enemy whose supply line had no bottom. When the U.S. Marines landed, the Japanese believed it was a minor setback, a temporary incursion they could easily crush. They sent their elite, Ichiki Detachment, a force that had known nothing but victory, to drive the Americans back into the sea. But in the Battle of the Tanado River, the Japanese were annihilated. It was a shock, but not the biggest one. The real shock came afterward. Instead of licking their wounds, the Americans just kept coming. Wave after wave of reinforcements landed. New planes appeared on Henderson Field to replace those shot down. Mountains of supplies, food, ammunition, fuel piled up on the beaches. For the Japanese soldiers and pilots, it was a bewildering and demoralizing spectacle. One Japanese officer, watching from the hills, wrote about the endless stream of American transport ships appearing on the horizon each morning. He described it as a magic trick, a supply chain that defied all logic. While his own men were starving, surviving on coconuts and boiled grass, the Americans seemed to have an infinite pantry. They were fighting an enemy that could afford to lose. Every American plane shot down felt like a victory, but the next day, 3 more would be there to take its place. This wasn't just a battle. It was a war of attrition, and Japan was on the losing side of the equation. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters was still operating under the delusion that they could sustain a long war. Their pre-war calculations were based on the idea that America, a soft consumer society, would lose its will to fight after a few sharp, decisive defeats. But Guadalcanal was proving this theory disastrously wrong. The Americans weren't just fighting, they were fighting with an overwhelming material advantage that Japan simply could not match. The numbers were stark. For every 1 ton of supplies that reached Japanese troops on Guadalcanal, the Americans delivered over 100 tons to their own. The Japanese called Henderson Field the airstrip of death, not just for the men who died attacking it, but for the resources it consumed. They threw their best pilots and planes into the meat grinder, but the American industrial engine just kept churning out more. A psychological shift began to ripple through the Japanese high command. Publicly, they maintained the rhetoric of victory and spiritual superiority. The Yamato's spirit, they claimed, would triumph over mere material wealth. But privately, in secret reports and diaries, a sense of dread began to creep in. Officers who had once confidently predicted victory started writing desperate memos. One report, circulated secretly among the naval staff, starkly stated, "The United States has no bottom." It was a devastating admission. They were facing an enemy whose capacity to produce and replace was practically limitless. While Japan's own merchant fleet was being systematically sunk by American submarines, crippling their ability to supply even basic necessities. The U.S. was launching new ships faster than Japan could sink them. The Japanese Navy, once the pride of the empire, found itself in an impossible situation. They could win tactical victories at sea, sinking American warships in the brutal naval battles around the island, like the Battle of Savo Island. But these victories were pure. Japan couldn't replace its lost ships. America could, and did, with terrifying speed. The USS Yorktown, sunk at Midway, was replaced by a new Essex-class carrier that bore the same name. The USS Hornet, lost in the Santa Cruz Islands, was also replaced. Japan's carrier fleet, on the other hand, was a finite resource. Every loss was a permanent wound. The fuel situation was just as dire. Japanese destroyers were forced to make high-speed Tokyo Express runs down the Slut to deliver handfuls of supplies, burning precious fuel that the Empire couldn't afford to spare. Meanwhile, American tankers arrived in convoys, refueling the entire U.S. fleet on site. This wasn't just a logistical failure. It was the collapse of a worldview. The Japanese military had been built on a foundation of spiritual strength, discipline, and the belief in a single, decisive battle. But Guadalcanal wasn't a single battle. It was a 6-month-long slugfest, a war of numbers, production, and supply. It was a factory war, and Japan's factories were no match for America's. The average Japanese soldier on the island became a symbol of this disparity. They were starving, racked with disease, and fighting with outdated equipment, often down to their last few rounds of ammunition. They called Guadalcanal Starvation Island. Their bravery was undeniable, but bravery couldn't conjure food from thin air or stop an artillery shell. By February 1943, the Japanese were forced to admit defeat and evacuate their remaining troops. They had lost over 20,000 men, mostly to starvation and disease, along with hundreds of planes and dozens of warships. But the real loss was the illusion that they could ever win a prolonged war against the United States. Guadalcanal laid Japan's industrial inferiority bare for all to see. The confident planners in Tokyo who had gambled on a short war were now facing the consequences of their miscalculation. The grinding machine of Guadalcanal had not only chewed up Japan's soldiers and sailors, but it had also shattered their strategy and exposed the fatal weakness at the heart of their empire. The war was far from over, but after Guadalcanal, its ultimate outcome was no longer in doubt. The path to Tokyo had begun, paved by the endless American supply line. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most decisive and, frankly, one-sided battles of the entire Pacific War. This is the story of the day. Japan's military leaders were forced to confront a reality they had long tried to deny. The war was lost. We're talking about the Battle of the Philippine Sea, better known by its grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By June 1944, the tide of the war had well and truly turned. The American industrial machine was operating at a level the world had never seen, churning out ships, planes, and trained pilots at a staggering rate. Meanwhile, Japan was struggling. Its veteran pilots, the skilled few who had dominated the skies in the early days of the war, were nearly all gone. They had been lost at Midway, at Guadalcanal, and in the long, attritional campaigns across the Solomon Islands. In their place were new recruits rushed through a training system that was simply inadequate to prepare them for what they were about to face. The Japanese High Command, however, was banking on one last, great, decisive battle. They called their Planago. The idea was to lure the American fleet into a massive carrier engagement. They believed their new aircraft, like the A6M50, and their supposedly superior fighting spirit, would overcome America's numerical advantage. They gathered nearly every operational warship and aircraft they had left. This was an all-or-nothing gamble, and they were pushing all their chips to the center of the table. The American force they were sailing to meet was Task Force 58, the heart of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. It was, without exaggeration, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, the same man who had engineered the victory at Midway. It was built around 15 aircraft carriers. 15. That number alone was staggering. These carriers held nearly 1,000 modern aircraft, including the formidable F-6F Hellcat fighter. And these planes were flown by pilots who were not just numerous, but exceptionally well-trained, with hundreds of flight hours under their belts before they ever saw combat. Crucially, the Americans also had a technological ace up their sleeve: superior radar and combat information centers. On each carrier, a team of operators could watch the skies 4 miles around, identifying enemy formations long before they were visible to the naked eye. They could vector their fighters to intercept incoming raids with terrifying precision. Japan had radar, but it was far less advanced and not as effectively integrated into their command structure. This technological gap would prove to be absolutely fatal. The battle began on June 19, 1944. The Japanese launched their first wave of aircraft, confident they would strike a crippling blow. But long before they reached the American fleet, they appeared as blips on radar screens across Task Force 58. The call went out. "Hey, Rube," the signal to scramble all fighters. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Hundreds of American Hellcats climbed to meet the incoming Japanese planes. A U.S. pilot on the intercom famously exclaimed, "This is like an old-time turkey shoot," and the name stuck. The Japanese pilots, many with minimal training, flew into a perfectly orchestrated wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of veteran American fighter pilots. Transcripts from Japanese communications, later analyzed by the Americans, paint a horrifying picture. You hear initial confidence turn to confusion, then to sheer panic. Pilots reported being overwhelmed, seeing their comrades' planes exploding all around them. One Japanese officer watching from his flagship described it as watching eggs being thrown against a stone wall. They were being systematically annihilated. Wave after wave of Japanese planes met the same fate. They were shot down in droves, miles from their targets, many never even catching a glimpse of an American ship. By the end of the first day, the numbers were just breathtaking. Japan had lost over 300 aircraft and a huge portion of their remaining experienced pilots. American losses in the air, fewer than 30. It was one of the most lopsided aerial victories in history. Adding to the disaster, American submarines found and sank two of Japan's largest aircraft carriers, the Sokaku and the brand new Tiho, which was serving as the fleet's flagship. The next day, Admiral Spruance, after ensuring the safety of the Saipan invasion force, turned west to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet. Late in the afternoon, American scout planes finally found them. Despite the setting sun and the extreme range, a massive strike was launched. American pilots pressed their attack in the fading light, sinking another Japanese carrier, the Hio, and damaging several other ships. The return flight was perilous. Flying back in total darkness, many planes were running on fumes. In one of the most famous and compassionate decisions of the war, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the carrier group, ordered turn on the lights. All the ships in the fleet illuminated themselves, lighting up the night sky to guide their pilots home. It was a huge risk, as it could have revealed their position to enemy submarines, but it saved the lives of many pilots who would have otherwise been lost to the sea. After the battle, the internal reports within the Japanese military were brutally honest. For the first time, there was no spinning the truth, no talk of spiritual victory. The reports, which were kept secret from the public, openly admitted defeat on every level. They acknowledged that American pilots were better trained, their radar was superior, their carriers were more numerous, and their production capacity was simply overwhelming. Analysts within the Japanese government, much like Germany's Albert Speer, had been running the numbers. Their assessments were bleak. They concluded that the United States was building carriers, planes, and ships at a rate that Japan could not hope to match, even if they multiplied their entire industrial output by 10. The material gap was no longer a gap, it was a chasm. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was the moment the music stopped. Privately, from Prime Minister Tojo on down, Japan's leaders knew the war was unwinnable. They had lost their naval air power, the very weapon they had used to start the war at Pearl Harbor. They had no way to replace the planes, no way to replace the carriers, and absolutely no way to replace the pilots. The strategic equation was solved, and the answer was defeat. So why did the war continue for another brutal year? This is the ultimate tragedy of the story. It wasn't about ignorance. It was about paralysis. The leadership was trapped by the very ideology they had created. The concepts of honor, of never surrendering, and the divine status of the emperor made it impossible for them to act on the knowledge they possessed. To admit defeat would be a national humiliation beyond comprehension. And so, rather than adjust their strategy or seek a diplomatic off-ramp, they doubled down on a fight they knew they could not win. They chose to sacrifice hundreds of thousands more of their own people, and many allied lives as well, in a futile defense of their homeland. The lesson from the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot is a profound one. It shows how industrial might and technological superiority can be decisive in modern warfare. But it also reveals the tragic paralysis that can grip a nation when its leaders are blinded by pride and ideology, unable to face an undeniable and catastrophic reality. It was the day Japan knew the war was lost, but lacked the courage to end it.